Episode 81, July the 30th, 1915. First use of liquid fire. I saw men consumed by it at Hooge, by Private A.P. Hatton. Read by Guy Parker. Private Hatton witnessed the horrible results of the first use of liquid fire by the Germans against the British troops at Hooge. He describes the fury which this barbarous method of assault and the bitter fighting which ensued. There is little wonder that the action resulted in small gains for the Germans. There were 3 of us in my platoon who had stuck together as pals ever since we went out to the front in March, including the affairs at Ch12 and Ypres, although we were only in reserve there and so did not lose many men. Starting from Good Friday, we had spent 3 months continuously in the trenches, 4 days in and 4 days out at a time. That 3 months was a comparative picnic, and we lived like lords. There was myself, Lance Corporal C, and young Private B, who you may call for your convenience Robbie. Lance Corporal C got a weekly parcel from a young lady he was engaged to. Cigarettes, soup cubes, sardines, curry powder, cakes, etc. Robbie was always getting parcels, 2 or 3 a week sometimes, from his young wife, as she had a very good job in the potteries, and he married her just before he left for the front. I got nothing, as I had run away from home to enlist, but my pals shared and shared alike, and we were soon as chirpy as crickets. Not at first, though, for Robbie was very soft about his girl wife, and when the first shells came over at Bailleul, I noticed the poor fellow's lips twitching and his eyes drawn. When we were on sentry at night, he did nothing but chatter nervously to me about his wife and her loneliness all the time. C was a natural funny dog and a dabster on the mouth organ, but as it was his one burning ambition to qualify for a short leave home in order to get married and get separation allowance for his lass, who was none too well off, he also seemed to shrink into himself at first, and pull away at his moustache with set face when the shells came. But they stuck it gamely, and after a month we took no more notice of the whiz-bangs, which always saluted us with a dose of morning hate at 5 a.m. and another dose of evening hate at 5 p.m, than you would of a wasp. For the weeks passed, and we were left in the same spot. We dug and contrived until our trenches were like well-paved streets, with secure head cover and with dugouts that were comparatively underground passages for comfort and security. We were also lucky in having the German lines at least 350 yards away, so that at night time we used to go out for a stroll to stretch our legs in front of the firing line, when not moonlight, of course, and we came to regard the bark of a shell as far worse than its bite. In fact, we often joked about them and made bets as to where they would fall, just the same as you read in war books. Then came reality. First near Ypres, during the spring battle, when we were shelled by monster howitzers, while we were exposed in the open on the march, and limbs flew through the air with the velocity of shell fragments, and then next at Hooge. This was easily our worst show. We had word from the general that a great deal depended on us, and that we were to hang on like grim death. That was when we marched off for the trenches at midnight, and we relieved a battalion that had had a terrible doing. My platoon of over 50 men had to relieve a platoon that consisted of only 14 sound men and no officers. And these trenches were like ruins of slums compared with the trenches we had left. The sandbag parapets were either smashed in or torn to pieces by shells. Barbed wire and staples had been blown over into the trench so that one could not pass along easily. The trench floor was a bumpy mixture of tumbled sandbags and ominous holes. "This looks like the real thing at last," said C, forcing a smile. I was one of a working party, told off to go out under him and re-erect the barbed wire entanglements, while the other men laboured like ants at the parapets. We were sniped at and shelled the whole time and had to do most of our work lying down. When the bullets came hotter, We felt that we would like to crunch our way right into the soil somehow, and for many long minutes we could do nothing but clutch at the long grass with our hands, chins well down, heels level with the earth. Even so, 2 men had to be dragged in with the bullets through their skulls, and my pal C got one through the fleshy part of the thigh. But he did not give in, and got me to help during the last half hour or so, when the firing had died down, in rigging up a rough overhead, splinter-proof for the officer's lookout. The guns restarted with awful fury at the very first streak of dawn, and alas, the very first shell shattered that splinter-proof to fragments. Luckily, the officer had just left it a second previously to order us to stand to arms. It was a day of horror. Hardly a man touched a mouthful of food, though we all seemed to be desperately thirsty. The shells came sailing over in unceasing wave upon wave of hot iron. I heard a poor fellow on my left, a Section D reserve man of the old school, mumbling broken prayers the whole time. He had seen a shell tear a frightful cavity in his young brother's breast. We all lived in a momentary expectation of a like fate. At nightfall, C and myself suggested something to eat, but poor Robbie, who had seen some men buried alive by a shell, refused to touch anything. C kept up a sort of forced liveliness, and when the sergeant major came along to say that we must be prepared to make a counterattack just before dawn, C asked if he might be allowed to go into action playing his mouth organ. Robbie, however, was very preoccupied, and his silence rather got on our already shaken nerves. "I'm very sorry," he said once, when we rallied him, "but I feel something's going to happen tomorrow. Still, if it does, do all you can to cheer up my wife, old pals, if you get through." We tried to laugh him down, but the laugh was a miserable failure somehow. Besides, shells were still coming over at regular intervals. The Germans, however, seemed to be aware that they had failed to shake us by that means, so they tried the despicable trick which so shocked the world. We first heard sounds as of a splashing to our front. Then there was a peculiar smoky smell, just like coal tar. Next, a corporal of C Company cried out that he'd been hit by a shell. Yet when we went to look at him, we found that a huge blister, as from a burn, was on his forehead, whilst the back of his cap was smouldering. We had no time to notice anything else, for after that preliminary trial, the Boche loosened their liquid fire upon us with a vengeance. It came in streams all over the earthworks, while shells containing starlights ignited the black fluid. Sandbags, blankets, topcoats, and anything of the sort that was handy smouldered and then flared. We were choked by the smoke and half scorched by the heat. Our first instinct had been to fly to our dugouts under the parapets where the liquid could not touch us. I know that C, Robbie and I had just made ourselves as safe as possible in our earthy nook when the captain's whistle blew and we heard the non-coms yelling, "Stand to arms!" The Germans were upon us. That dastardly liquid fire attack had been a mere preliminary, by which they had hoped to wipe us all out. But once again their plans had miscarried. Those of us who had survived felt enraged to such a pitch by the foulness of the deed and by the memory of our comrades' sufferings that we would have charged cheerfully straight into hell if only thereby we could have got at the enemy. We were not required to do that, however, for they came willingly to the slaughter themselves, for pure slaughter it was. Whether they were overconfident as to the deadly effects of their all-day shelling and then the liquid fire, I do not know. But certainly they came swaggering on in a sort of scrambling run with perfect carelessness and indifference. We did not make one sign. We waited, fingers on triggers. We had ample time to note that the first line of the attackers were all fine-picked men, the 126th and 132nd Regiments, but that behind them came a queer, hobbling, nondescript rabble of Landsturm reserves. Men dressed anyhow, all middle-aged, some with beards, many with glasses, and a number so fat that they could hardly waddle over the broken ground. I suppose it was pitiful that such men, fathers of families, should be sent as food for our British bullets. But we had no time to think then. We were just filled with the lust of killing, a lust that had been fully fed by that wicked liquid fire, and so we let them have it. Down went the first line of Prussians like ninepins, and immediately the poor devils of Landstern men turned tail, and we could pick them off at our leisure, while our artillery shrapnel shells fell among them just like fierce dogs worrying fat rats. The thrill of that was superb. There was no doubt in my mind now that Germany was very short of real men in that part of the line, and we knew that we could always beat them as men. We hardly lost a man in that little business, but it was in the charge, when we had to capture the German lines, that we suffered mostly. For their barbed wire was of inconceivable thickness and spread for hundreds of yards, while their trenches seemed to be manned by nothing but Maxim guns. Certainly very few Germans did we see as we plunged forward like one man, bubbling over with eagerness and excitement like wild beasts after raw meat. Yet all the time the bullets came at us in an unending stream, and men were going down all around me. As we took trench after trench, we got mixed up, and I sadly missed both C and Robbie. Then I found myself along with some men and an officer of the Durham Light Infantry, who had been charging after the Germans like furies let loose. We got into a German trench at last and took up positions to stem a coming counterattack. One of our young officers ran up with a machine gun on his shoulder, and we thought we were all right. But just as the Germans came on again, there was a very critical moment when the machine gun jammed and would not work. Moreover, our ammunition was running short. The machine gun officer was swearing and tugging at the gun and perspiring profusely. I was running up to give him a hand, as I know a bit about mechanism, when down I went, plugged by a bullet. But in the midst of my pain, I felt happy, as at last I heard the sweet music of the rat-tat-tat burst from our machine gun just near me. It was on the way back that I stumbled on the rigid body of poor Robbie, shot clean between the eyes.
Shouting out these pathetic